Good morning, everybody. And thank you for being on time and being here for the Agriculture Sustainability Framework. Sorry, I've seen too many conferences this week. It's definitely an agriculture in the Gold Coast vibe. But before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the lands that we meet on and the traditional owners who are here, past, present and emerging. It is a privilege to open this event, and so many of you gathered here from industry, from government, from farmers who actually are some of the key people that we're doing this work for. The fact that we're all here really does speak to the impact that sustainability has. It's not just a word, it's not just a byproduct, it's something that we're actually incorporating into our everyday production. It's credentials, it's making sure we're getting regulations right, it's making sure we're having the right conversations. And we know the pressures that are coming on. We know that the marketers are asking for more evidence. We know that the regulators are setting higher standards. We know that investors want clarity and clear understanding of what those standards mean to the production. But we also know that this is all about producing food in the best possible way and ensuring that Australia, when we say Australia and we say green and clean, has some real credentials behind it. We're responding with strength, we're responding to these challenges by these frameworks. And we also understand that this isn't trying to replace or take over certain aspects. This is setting the framework for us working together. It's about industries aligning, about industries ensuring that we are talking the same language. And that's why this exchange is important. It's about bringing everyone together to have those conversations and have that common understanding. Making sure that we are moving from intent to action with good ideas in real-world solutions. Obviously, the National Farmers Federation have been proud supporters of this program ever since it was both announced and put forward with the support of the federal government. And we acknowledge the fact that we have Matt here today and many of the departmental leads for this program. And without them, we wouldn't be talking about this unified program for all of industry. Their support and ongoing funding of the program has been absolutely the foundation of getting the program to where we are and also for where we want this program to go, noting that it is now up to us to take the next phase together. We have to make this stand on its own 2 feet and actually show that we, the industry, will pull this through. So today is about looking forward and understanding the global and domestic drivers, sharing the lessons from across the sectors and how we can continue ahead. As mentioned, we have got Matt here today. He is the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestries. He'll be sharing his insights on sustainability, the expectations of what it means for Australian agriculture and how the department fits into those visions. So with that in mind, can you put your hands together for Matt and we'll welcome him to the stage. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, DJ, and hello, everyone. So yes, Matt Lowe, DepSec for Fisheries and Forestry Policy Group in the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry. And yes, it is repetitive. And yes, it does get old very quickly. And I'd like to also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that First Nations people have been caring for this country for 65,000 plus years. I'd also like to extend my thanks to the National Farmers Federation and all the partners who have brought us together for this really important event. It really genuinely is a pleasure to be here for the 2025 Australian Agricultural Sustainability Exchange, and it marks the beginning of what promises to be a thought-provoking week leading into the NFF AgXchange. And obviously today's gathering brings together leaders from across industry, government, research and the supply chain to support the central question, how do we work together to shape the future of sustainability in agriculture? And throughout today we'll be discussing key drivers of sustainability in today's landscape, the evolution and significance of the Australian Agricultural Sustainability Framework, practical examples of sustainability in action, and case studies that highlight innovation across the sector. We'll also look ahead to what the future of sustainability in Australian agriculture might hold. But first, I always think, from a government perspective, we always try to think about the context. And the context we're operating in, the environment we're working in Australian agriculture, and how government policy can respond to that context and keep ensuring that Australian agriculture is at the forefront. And climate, I think, is central to everything that Australian agriculture has to deal with. Our farmers battle Australia's harsh climate every day, and the challenges we face are intensifying. Climate change is already impacting our landscapes and livelihoods. Now, many of you will have seen this graphic. I know DJ and I did a couple of weeks ago at the Drought Forum, and it was a kind of crystallising piece, I think, for the Drought Forum. It shows that the April to October trend from 1994 to 2023. And so much of what we term the wheat and sheep belt, which is the high productive agricultural region in Australia, is lowest on record or very much below average relative to all years from 1900 to 1993. So the last 30 years, so much of our agricultural high production landscapes have been lowest on record or very much below average. And going forward, the short story is that it's not going to get any easier. A few key points from the State of the Climate Report is that there'll be continued warming with more extremely hot days and fewer extremely cool days, a further decrease in cool season rainfall across many regions of the south and east, and likely increases in average duration of drought and aridity in regions within the south and east. And this impacts on production. This impacts on what farmers can achieve with the resources they've got. Now, I know this is the Agriculture Sustainability Exchange, but productivity is always front and centre of what we do as well, in terms of what we think about in agriculture and what is front and centre for farmers. Now, we know climate change is impacting and will impact on farm productivity and ultimately farm profits. You'll see from the chart on the left-hand side, is that right? Left-hand side. Productivity growth has slowed since the year 2000. And this varies across sectors, though, with cropping productivity growth higher versus livestock, where productivity growth is lower. One of the biggest impactors on that productivity growth slowing since the start of this century is climate. From 2001 to 2020, farm profits were 23% lower than from 1950 to 2000 due to changes in climate. In that same period, the difference between headline productivity and climate-adjusted productivity growth is 0.2%, which is more than market sector growth alone. So while we've got a good story to tell in terms of productivity growth, 0.74 is nothing to shy at and still outperforms every other sector. In terms of what we can achieve, it's being impacted by climate. So we've responded well, but the challenge continues. And you can see how far we're outperforming the rest of the economy with market sector growth at 0.13. So I think we've demonstrated Australian agriculture understands the effects of climate. We're on the front line, Australian agriculture is on the front line in terms of the effects of climate change, and we understand the implications of inaction. And I often get asked about sustainability versus productivity, sector growth versus sector resilience, and I do think there's two sides of the same coin. Supporting resilient sustainable farming systems isn't an option, it's essential. And it's basically what will support maintaining our ability to produce food and fibre as we navigate a changing climate and increasing environmental pressures. And these twin challenges of food security and climate change are global challenges and heightening global attention on the role of sustainable agriculture in feeding a growing population and reducing emissions. So improving sustainability presents not only a challenge, but a significant opportunity for us in Australia, and aligning investment with natural capital and productivity is a frontier we must pursue. Now at DAF we do like to talk about the productivity frontier, and some of you would have heard this again previously, but I just want to punctuate that opportunity. So ABARES has got lots of technical ways of describing it. I tend to go with the orange line at the top there is basically what our best farmers are achieving. And you can see, and that's the productivity frontier, and that's for broadacre farms. So the frontier is growing, but as you can see, so is the gap. And that means that our best is good, but so many of our producers have an opportunity to improve productivity. And we know one of the biggest drivers, again, for improved productivity is capability. And that capability goes to everything, all the ways you manage your farming system, including how sustainable it is. One last piece on context. I don't think anyone would have missed that the global trading environment is changing and changing rapidly. There's more violence in the trading system now than there has been in a very long time. Australian agriculture is an export-facing industry, and just to reinforce, about 70% of Australia's food and fibre that we produce is exported, and it continues to grow strongly. And you can see there, off the back of what has been since the start of this decade, years of record production, record exports as well. And our regional and rural communities rely greatly on those overseas markets buying their premium crops and livestock products. And the work that the government did around competition and competition-exposed industries really emphasised how important those export markets were, and effectively operating as a third supermarket to build in that extra competition and for producers to achieve better prices. But the global and trading environment, it's changing and it never stays still. And those markets are shifting and expectations are rising. The imposition of export bans, non-tariff barriers to trade, and application of prescriptive sustainability standards have been proven to undermine rather than promote sustainable production, climate objectives, and even domestic food security. And non-tariff measures are increasing each year to in effect represent a 19% tariff, and you can see how the work that ABARES has done demonstrates how the effect of those non-tariff measures on the global trading system, which is effectively an inhibitor on the price that our producers can achieve. So that's why government continues to engage internationally on sustainability and trade. Free and open trade, we're a big believer, has the potential to accelerate the global transition to sustainable agriculture. And it's a conversation that we explicitly have with DFAT around how our non-subsidised low emissions agriculture has a global story to tell. So we're building alliances with like-minded nations, those committed to improving sustainability in agricultural production and cooperating through multilateral forums, while respecting each country's unique environmental, cultural and economic context. Our department supports agricultural exports by negotiating technical market access, addressing trade barriers and influencing international standards, working closely with DFAT on free trade agreements and sustainability initiatives. And we also regulate agricultural exports as well, which enables access to those global markets. I think it's in the order of $270 million worth of agricultural exports each week. Key to market access is traceability, and we will be talking more about that throughout the course of the day, I understand. which is the capacity to track agricultural products from paddock to plate. It's integral to Australia's continued access in key export markets, supports our ability to respond to pest and disease outbreaks, and ensures food safety. And then added to that, sustainability is increasingly important to consumers and investors across markets. One thing I always want to ensure that we touch on is that Australia's farm gate emissions are amongst the lowest in the world, and we always need to take advantage of that opportunity, and that's the bottom chart there. We've already got a good story to tell globally about farm gate emissions, and that chart represents, for a representative basket of goods, Australia's emissions are amongst the lowest in the world. On that chart, I think we're the lowest, though Argentina always gives us a run for our money. So in terms of sustainability credentials, which are now being considered in trade policies and investment criteria around the world, we've got a good story to tell. We just need to make sure we tell it. With the rise of ESG reporting, climate and nature-related financial disclosures, and sustainability policies, it underscores the need for robust evidence-based credentials, and these credentials help maintain trust in Australia's reputation for safe, high-quality, sustainable food and fibre. We're committed to supporting the sector in developing consistent sustainability credentials that unlock export opportunities and reward sustainable practice. This requires robust, repeatable and cost-effective data, especially at the farm level. Innovation and smart technologies will be essential. And delivering ESG outcomes will be critical for farmers and exporters to maintain a competitive advantage while supporting positive environmental outcomes. Now, DAF, as one of Australia's key economic development agencies, is focused on supporting producers to build resilient, profitable businesses that contribute to broader social and environmental goals. And realising these opportunities requires deep collaboration across governments, producers, industry and representative bodies. Now, up on the screen you can see some of our key programs. What I did want to touch on, and hopefully many of you are familiar with those, what I did want to touch on was the Ag and Land Sector Plan, which was released as part of the Australian Government's announcement last week of the 2035 emissions reduction target and the release of the Net Zero Plan. So Australia has signed up to the Paris Agreement and is committed to reaching net zeros by 2050, and the Net Zero Plan charts a course of how we'll get there. And it shows how we can achieve a fair and orderly transition that builds on Australia's strengths and assures all Australians benefit. And many of you here were involved directly in the development of the Ag and Land Sector Plan, one of the 6 sector-level plans released with the 2035 target, and many of you will be integral in delivering that Ag and Land Sector Plan here today. It's something we're really proud of. It's something we've feel like we've listened to really carefully from across the sector, and certainly the themes in there are themes that have come through really compellingly in the conversations that we've had, and it will help ensure Australian producers remain leaders in low emissions food and fibre as we transition to net zero, and crucially maintain productivity while reducing emissions as well. Lastly, the government is also developing a national bioenergy feedstock strategy to unlock new economic opportunities in agriculture and forestry. And that will support Australia's net zero goals by helping decarbonise sectors like aviation and heavy transport. The strategy aims to grow the feedstock industry without compromising food and fibre security. So given this context, the challenges and the opportunities, but also I think worth reflecting on our unique institutional architecture and program architecture in Australia, and be remiss not to mention the RDCs and that setup, which is the envy of the world. We're really well positioned in Australia to continue to lead, not follow, global sustainability expectations and tell our incredible story on our terms. This is where initiatives like the AASF are so important, And with $9 million in government investment, the industry-led framework is showcasing our strengths in working together. It is a world-leading national-level sustainability framework, and as a powerful communication tool, offers significant opportunity to promote Australian agriculture on the world stage. It's an example of how successfully the different parts of industry can come together to tackle these big cross-cutting sector-wide issues. It's great to see industry leadership, shared responsibility, and the cooperative movement towards a sustainable future. It's really pleasing to see the AASF gaining recognition overseas as Australia's leadership in agriculture sustainability becomes increasingly visible. And looking ahead, the framework is shaping the future of sustainability in Australian agriculture. It provides clarity and consistency, reducing confusion and duplication in a complex environment and helping farmers to meet market and corporate requirements. By harmonising the concepts of sustainability, it can reduce regulatory burden and improve productivity across the supply chain. And it positions Australia perfectly to lead, not follow, global sustainability expectations. We need a national story of Australian agriculture's sustainability, one that is clear, evidence-based, that's always important for agriculture, and trusted. And that story will help us maintain and strengthen market access, attract investment, and enhance our global competitiveness. It's genuinely a privilege to be part of today's exchange. Thank you so much for having me, and I hope the discussions ahead spark new ideas and lasting connections. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. And it's always interesting when Matt puts that map up of how the climate has changed. And I know that in our area, we see it as a challenge, but also an opportunity to activate all the different technologies, all the different research that is going on, to be able to still maintain an average production in essentially a decile 3 year. That's really what the innovation is part of the story. It's now expressing that. And that's why when we do talk about framework, and we do talk about working to express the clean and green that we know, but in a language that the international markets can utilise, is so important. And then for us then to collectively use that language, make sure that our industries are somewhat aligned in the different ways that we go about collecting data and sharing data is really important. So Matt, to you and your team, we see it as an integral part, and we do look forward to working further on this journey together. But without further ado, I should introduce our MC for the day. Angela Schuster is probably known to most of you here as far as the lady who helps drive the sustainability framework. Angela is a primary producer from the central west of New South Wales, running crops and wool and cattle. She's also chair of the Agricultural Business Research Institute and Standards Australia Technical Committee. I don't know what the acronym for that is, on data-driven food and fibre systems. Importantly, Angela is the project manager for the Australian Agriculture Sustainability Framework and a long-standing member of the cross-functional team driving this work forward. She brings both a farmer's perspective and deep industry experience, and we're fortunate to have her to guide us through today's program. So can you put your hands together for Angela? Thank you.
Thanks for that introduction, DJ. And Standards Australia does not do acronyms nearly as well as the agricultural industry does, I assure you. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's exchange. I am absolutely privileged to be here today to lead you on the journey. And yes, Katie McRobert, I have used the word journey. We actually have a long-standing joke about using the word journey because my gosh, it has been a journey to get to where we are. And the reality is that we still have a very long journey in front of us as well. As a producer myself and someone who has worked alongside many of you here today on this journey over the last few years, I know how important it is to have a space where we can come together and we can talk, not just to talk, but where we can listen and we can exchange ideas and insights and spark new ideas and new innovations as a result of that. And that's particularly important when you look at Matt's presentation around the productivity gap there, as well as sparking new ideas and sparking insights and sparking innovation that will help us close that gap. And Matt, thank you very much for that insight. I tried to look for the opportunity in that, but as a producer, I have to admit I was a little bit gutted to see it too. So the Exchange is exactly about this. We want to bring you all together. We want to bring together primary producers. We've got industry bodies represented here today. We've got government, financiers, researchers and innovators. And really what we want to do today is explore how sustainability in Australian agriculture can continue to evolve. Today you're going to hear stories and insights from across the supply chain. You'll hear stories and insights from on-farm. You'll hear lessons from pilots and projects that have been underway and perspectives from global markets. Our task here is to showcase innovation, share what's working, and hopefully we might actually hear a little bit about what's not working, because that's where the learning occurs for many of us as well. We're going to also test ideas here today that will help us ensure that the story of sustainability that we take to markets and investors is credible and reflects the reality of Australians' productive environment. So we've got a jam-packed agenda ahead of us. We have had a few changes. I'll talk you through those as we go. But I do need to kick off with some housekeeping, so bear with me. Bathrooms out the door and to your left. If you would like to take a stroll as part of your bathroom break and rest your legs, please don't do it during the sessions. Feel free to do that during the breaks. There are further bathrooms to the right as well. We are going to have regular breaks today, so please put your phones on silent. Understand if you need to duck out and take a call, we all have jobs to do, but just make sure that those phones are on silent. I have been instructed to tell you, and I have been instructed to tell you this, if you are smoking or vaping, please walk straight out the front door and keep walking until your feet get wet, and then you can smoke or vape there. Water is actually over here available in the room. Please help yourself as required. Our breaks will actually be served through the doors that don't look like doors. They look like part of the wall, but they are actually directly behind us there. So those doors will magically open and we will be able to enjoy food and some social interaction, because again, that's important for today too. So in case of an emergency, you will hear beep, beep, beep. Stay here when you hear that. Prepare to evacuate. When you hear whoop, 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 that means get up and we need to leave now. And I can tell you at midnight the other night at the Sofitel, we did get the beep, beep, beep for about half an hour. We didn't get to the whoop, 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 luckily, so we didn't have to evacuate, but half an hour of beep, beep, beep was more than enough to give me a headache. So just a couple of other points I'll make very quickly. The way that we're going to run this session today overall is going to be quite fluid. So we will get various speakers up on stage. I have the privilege of introducing a range of fascinating people today. And then we also have panel sessions planned for a couple of the sessions as well, where we will hand over to some chairs and they will talk us through a bit about what the various speakers have to say, and it's an opportunity for some conversation from the floor as well. So our first session today is exploring some of the drivers of sustainability, and this is always an interesting question around what is driving sustainability. In particular, we're focusing on markets, the value chain and finance, and we're also going to touch on community trust. So our first two speakers today, we have a couple of team sessions here. So our first two speakers are looking at an examination of valued sustainability credentials in key international markets. And that is being led by Neil McSkimming from Agriculture Victoria and Dr. Melindy Hasty from the University of Melbourne. So Neil is a Senior Policy Officer at AgVec, and he provides advice on international market access, trade and capability building to grow the state's agricultural industry. Melindy is a research fellow at the University of Melbourne School of Agriculture, Food and Ecosystem Science. And Melindy has over 20 years' experience in R&D leadership for academia and international FMCGs such as Cadbury, Kraft and Mondelez. So if I can just welcome Neil and Melindy to the stage, please. Oh, there you are, right in front of me.
Thanks, Angela, for the kind introduction. Dr. Melindy Hastie and myself are delighted to be here today to present our work on credentialing for international markets. We do hope that will help to inform the conversation on sustainable agriculture as it develops during today's exchange. I'm going to kick off our presentation with a brief summary of the project in the context of the Victorian Government, and then hand over to Dr. Hastie, who will take you through the research itself. Before I do get started, it's important to note that the University of Melbourne's research results are valuable considerations, however not necessarily the policy of the Victorian Government. All right, so a snapshot of Victoria's agriculture sector, not strategy. It is critical to our economy and our rural communities. It delivers over $20 billion in gross value of agricultural production annually, and also provides over 150,000 jobs in the agriculture sector and food manufacturing. Okay, our policy work has identified that sustainable agricultural practices and traceability are becoming of increasing importance to the productivity and growth of our state's agriculture sector. That's why, since 2017, we've invested over $100 million into traceability and sustainable agricultural programs. These are both are really focused on capability building for the sector and delivering on Victoria's agriculture strategy for a strong, innovative and sustainable agriculture sector. For more information on our programs, you can go to our website, which is shown here. Okay, more related to the project. As Matt said, in a rapidly changing international trade environment, we want to be able to ensure our exporters have the necessary capabilities to prosper. So we wanted to be able to understand how Victoria's agriculture sector can realise the benefits of its credentials in international markets, and what we can do as a state government to support that. Our initial research identified that industry has been proactive in the development of sustainability frameworks, not only domestically here with our framework, but also globally. And there's a growing need from our trading partners and consumers for credentialing. This is evidenced by the emergence of things such as trade barriers like the EU deforestation regulations and their carbon border adjustment mechanisms, and also the appearance of products in the marketplace like carbon neutral beef, etc. The value of credentials, however, is largely unknown to us. And when I talk about value, I'm talking about value far broader than just the monetary return you're going to get for your product. I'm talking about better market access. I'm talking about you being identified as a preferred supplier in the marketplace. We also recognise that compliance and enforcement costs money, and somebody's got to pay for it along the way. These things aren't cheap. So the question is, what government policy settings will be beneficial? So that's why, for these reasons, we engaged the University of Melbourne to undertake an examination of valued credentials in international markets for us. And we also wanted to be able to leverage the university's extensive customer insights database, which they have amassed, and their other resources. Victoria supports a national approach to credentialing. We recognise the complexity of supply chains and that not one party alone can act and to build an ecosystem of trusted credentials for our exports. We're looking to work collaboratively with industry and governments across Australia, and we feel we have a lot to offer in the way of research, resources and connections. So essentially that frames the project in the context of the Victorian Government. Now I'm going to hand over to Dr. Hastie, who will take you through the research itself. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil, for the introduction, and thanks to the organisers today for giving us the opportunity to share some of our project findings. I'll jump straight into it. So basically, as Neil's already alluded to, there was a real dearth of knowledge around consumer response to sustainable credentials for food products. And this project was really designed to start addressing some of those gaps in our key markets. So we decided to focus on the UK, US, Indonesia and Vietnam for our study. I won't be able to share all the results today, but we'll give you a taster of some of our key takeouts. We have two-phase project designed, and basically what we had was a literature review or review process where we looked at not only the scientific literature, but what's available in the public domain on websites, and in cases where I could, we sent students out to take photos of retail in market for fresh produce. Phase two was a series of consumer studies that we conducted with consumers from those markets, trying to understand the drivers of trust for those consumers, willingness to pay, and even preference in store. So to start the project, the first question we had was how are we going to define sustainability? It's such a broad term used in so many different forums. We went straight to the Australian Agricultural Sustainability Framework as our first port of call, and we reviewed the topics within that framework and decided to really focus on where we were likely to see certifications or claims on pack that were visible for the consumer at point of purchase. So I guess it's really to highlight the fact this project is really focusing on consumer response, and therefore we've used a lot of labels that are present for representing a range of schemes across all these areas that we've highlighted. So things like welfare, fair trade, etc. One of the first parts of work that we did was go back and have a look at a database that we currently have at the University of Melbourne that was set up comparing Chinese and Australian consumer response to a range of food products and trying to understand what were the terms that drive the indication of premium for those consumers. And you can see straight away when we look at this data that for Chinese consumers across the board, organic was the most preferred label, most compelling. And when we talked to the consumers from China, we found that this is because they believe it's safer to consume and also better for them. And that was a primary concern as they were looking at making product selection. We also see that traceability was important to this group, and for some products, being from Australia was also compelling. So for meat and wine, being Australian was a positive thing for this group. And then as we move across to the other work that we did, the further insights, we saw from the scientific literature that there's quite a lot of evidence that consumers actually do find sustainability compelling, and they would be willing to pay more for products that bear these labels, but it has to be trusted labels. And what constitutes a trusted label really varies with the market that we're looking at. So for instance, when we were looking at Vietnam, we could see that they put a lot of trust in things like USDA labels, USDA organic, European organic, whereas their local labels such as Viet Gap, etc., were viewed with quite a bit of scepticism and not trusted just based on their personal feelings about how those labels may have been obtained. We also saw that there's big differences in how developed markets and developing markets have gone about adopting sustainability credentials, and we see that the developed markets are often responding to consumer demand for sustainability or animal welfare, whereas the developing markets are often focusing on protecting their export markets. We saw a lot of enabling strategies involving government that were in use to help launch these schemes or participation, and we saw that government can play a really important role in making sure a scheme is credible for the consumer. We also saw that there's lots of value in industry and government collaborating, and so the government can focus on what are the sustainability development goals they want to deliver for their country, and industry is keeping an eye on the profitability, the market access and all the feasibility aspects of investing into these type of schemes and being successful. We also saw that adoption and harmonisation of international schemes can lead to ease trade, but also lead to making rapid goals in terms of reaching sustainability goals in your production. Furthermore, we had a number of strategies that we felt we saw delivered premium value for producers, and these were things around developing sustainable, credible schemes, also making sure that there was a harmonisation which would help ease international trade, and also in making sure that consumers are educated on the value of these schemes, and this builds trust. Furthermore, I'll jump in now to our consumer study results, and just to give you some background into the methodology, basically we ran a series of focus groups with consumers from each of the countries of interest, and we followed up each of these hour-long interviews with an online survey where we interrogated them about things like purchase drivers and willingness to pay. In the case of this work that we've completed, we were focusing on cherries as the case study, and we chose cherries just because we know there is a reasonable amount of price elasticity for fresh cherries around the world. So we designed the stimulus that we shared with the consumers in the interviews to have a number of direct factors that they would be looking at, which is, you can see here is the example of some of the badging that we shared with them on cherry packages. So we were focusing on international schemes that were likely to appear in that market, local Australian schemes, and also making sure we included products from countries that were also likely to be exporting cherries to that market. Indirect factors were also considered. So we know that typically consumers are really focused on product quality when they're purchasing fresh produce. So we needed to make sure that we were capturing that and trying to understand where sustainability was sitting relative to the importance of product quality. And we also looked at things like point of sale and price. So here is the first map that we produced from our UK consumer group. So this represents a number of consumer groups consolidated. And what you can see is we have a horizontal axis that goes from unlikely to purchase to likely to purchase, and then a vertical axis from not trusted to trusted. And so that upper right quadrant is really the compelling space where those products are well considered by the consumers from the UK. And we see that the red tractor is very important for the UK consumer, and we also see that the Soil Association badge is also important. Now, both these schemes originate in the UK, were recognised by the UK consumers, typically only applied to UK products, so that was a key driver for them. As we move down, we see that we have on the bottom left-hand corner the Australian products, and this was really around the fact that they didn't believe that the product could be fresh and the quality acceptable if it had travelled all the way from Australia. So moving on to purchase drivers, as expected, we see product quality is quite important, but we also see country of origin as sitting there at top 3. And that was interesting to us, that it was actually trumping some product quality attributes. And in the case of UK consumers, if it didn't come from the UK, that's a really negative effect. And that was basically how they were using that country of origin. We see sustainable farming is very interesting for this consumer group as well. It sits around the 60% mark, and we can talk about that in relation to what we see with the Indonesians shortly. In terms of willingness to pay, we can see in the red circle what we were currently getting for fresh cherries in Australia, which was around the $17.50 mark. And we can see that underneath that, the UK consumers expecting to see fair trade, red tractor, and the Soil Association badge for the same sort of value. And in fact, we see right at the bottom of that pale blue arrow that's not very clear at the moment, but is where we find most of our Australian badges. So there's no price uplift for any Australian cherries in this market, and the opportunity is really not there. However, when we look at Indonesian consumers, what we can see here in that top right quadrant where you want to be, we start seeing Australian badges and the traceability badge, which they were quite attracted to. On the opposite end of that line of products, we can see USA and Chile products. And when we talk to these consumers, partly it was due to distance and not believing it's fresh, but partly it was a political choice to be boycotting US products. As we look at the purchase drivers, we can see, again, quality rules in the top 5, but country of origin's there. But in terms of the Indonesian consumer, it could be a positive or negative thing that the product came out of Indonesia. It just depended on the country in particular. Sustainable farming is not so important for this group, and we can see that it's sitting quite a way down in terms of about 35%. Willingness to pay, we can see right at the top that we've got the Australian products with a significant price uplift from the $17.50 that we were achieving in the local market at the time. So again, there's an opportunity here for products, partly based on being Australian, but also based on being sustainable. And our conclusions really were that, yes, there is value in being sustainable for the consumer. However, you really need to understand your market and the nuances of that before you would go and invest in sustainable credentials. And also that there is benefit in government and industry collaborating on sustainability. And that brings me briefly to the close, and here's all the many people that helped on the project, and here's our contact details. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Neil and Melindy. I have to admit, I got a sneak peek of their findings a couple of months ago, and I am a closet geek, so I got really, really excited about this, and the conversation went on for quite some time, mainly because there's a project that you'll hear about later on today that I'm working on with my colleague Dr. David Lemon from CSIRO, that is looking at sustainability credentials as well, and there were some similarities in what we were finding. There were some areas of divergence, but for the reasons because the projects were looking at things quite differently. So it was really, really interesting to hear their learnings and the alignment with the learnings that David and I are looking at. And I think that's an example of how we are all looking at various components of sustainability, and being able to bring these things together and share ideas and insights is such an important opportunity. So our next, opportunity to share insights is looking at tracing carbon emissions in the wine value chain, and we have Anna Hooper from Australian Grape and Wine and Andrew Skinner from More Than Machines joining us. So Anna is a wine industry professional since the late 90s, working in vineyard management and winemaking both in Australia and overseas. And she is currently the Policy Director at Australian Grape and Wine, with board and advocacy experience in sustainability. Andrew is a technology leader with 25 years experience. He's formerly Chief Data Officer at Meat and Livestock Australia. And Andrew founded the technology consultancy More Than Machines, love the name, where he assists agri-food organisations, startups, researchers and governments in developing digital strategies, policies and technology solutions that leverage data and AI to optimise their land, production, markets and products. So please join me in welcoming Anna and Andrew to the stage.
Hi everyone, and thanks for the introduction. As Angela said, we're talking about a project tracing carbon emissions in an international value chain between Australia and Singapore. The project was funded by the Department for Ag, Fisheries and Forestry, so thank you, under a traceability grant, a Southeast Asia round. It's a proof of concept project involving a consortium of contributors that included the South Australian Government, and the major delivery partner, Swaine, was also brought to us by the South Australian Government as an expert in this field, but also as a company being based in Singapore, where they were trying to build trade investment relationships. So the project sought to solve the problem of the emerging issue of emissions reporting requests, not by trying to make it go away as such, but by making it as easy as it possibly could be. So as we all probably know, when we sell our products, they become some other entity's Scope 3 emissions reporting obligations. So even if you're not obliged to report under corporate reporting requirements, the entities that we transact with may decide that they want to calculate their Scope 3s at a more granular level rather than using, say, emissions factors or cost-based methods. So we can pretend this isn't happening, but the reality is that it already is happening. In wine, for example, we're finding that tenders for wine supply contracts are starting to ask for product carbon footprints. The interesting thing about wine in this respect is that several of our major trading nations are owned by government liquor monopolies. So the liquor monopolies, basically because through the fact that they own the entire market, don't compete with other firms, so they have the ability to impose costs on their supply chains that other retailers may not choose to do, so that those costs might be green or red tape. This was initially to sort of combat alcohol-related harm, but that same controlling, the same ability to control the market is now translating into how environmental policies or sustainability requirements are imposed upon the supply chain. And when we see this happening in one country, then the others tend to follow. So we recognise this being an emerging problem and attempted to address the issue by creating an exchange platform that provides a simplified way of passing emissions information on what is a relatively complex supply chain in wine more easily to create carbon footprint calculations. And here's how it works. So there's really three elements to this, and the first involves establishing a trusted community of value chain participants. The next part is establishing a methodology for doing the carbon calculations, and then the third part came the technology, which is about creating a secure data platform for sharing information. So we really found that the most critical component in all of this was building that trusted community. There's other issues around like the methodology and making sure that it's consistent with international approaches. That's a challenge that we recognise is difficult to solve for anyone. So rather than front-loading that as a problem, we really focused on what this project's trying to deliver, which is establishing that kind of community for the sharing of data. The approach follows a method of carbon accounting called the e-liability method. It was developed at Harvard University and based on the same concept as activity-based costing or activity-based accounting. It's cradle to gate, and basically the emissions are passed down the supply chain to the final customer, and that sort of represents the supply chain for wine. Actually, I'll go back, sorry. So learning about e-liability was one of the most interesting parts of the project for me, because it's a concept that seeks to address that problem of the same emissions potentially being reported multiple times by different reporting entities. It also is based on the idea of simplifying data collection, improving the accountability, and the idea that companies need only to collect data from their immediate suppliers, so it theoretically improves accuracy and efficiency. And the project also followed the PACT, Partnerships for Carbon Transparency methodology, which is about how carbon footprints are shared, information is shared across value chains. Embedded within the platform is its own carbon calculator, which is owned by the delivery partner Swane, but this importantly can be exchanged with other carbon calculators as well. So in the carbon calculator we've got emissions factors, which are like from national databases, things like fuel and electricity. We could potentially also add in product emissions factors for things like grapes, where you might not want to collect the information from each and every grower in a bottle of wine. One of the things we found out during the project is it's not uncommon for there to be small components of multiple different growers' vineyards in one single bottle of wine, just because of winemakers' love of blending. So ideally, but the idea is that ideally that you use, they're the emissions factors, but ideally what you do is you, for inputs into the wine, you take it straight out of the data community. from the exchange. So this is essentially what the whole idea of what the aim of the game is all about. So as a business, you'd have a list of the products that you supply, each with their own emissions per unit, and then you have the ability to push share, and that shares it with your partners who are also in the exchange, and you can invite partners, and it's, a little bit like Facebook, I suppose. But it's only, you only share with the person that you transact with directly, so that's kind of a key to it. So whilst collectively it can penetrate quite deep down into the supply chain, each person only has to disclose information to their immediate trading partner. So to run through how this works schematically, as a grape grower, you put in your scope 1s and 2s, in this case fuel and electricity. Then you use the exchange to take your inputs, fertiliser and pesticide, for example, add your transport costs, and then calculate the footprint of your load and then put it back into the exchange. Then the winemaker, and this is just a segment, like there's lots of other participants in the supply chain that would be doing the same, but the winemaker would do the same. They'd put their purchased CO2, fuel and electricity in, and then they would take their partner products out of the exchange, add their freight, and then back into the exchange for final consumption by the end user. What this does is creates a little donut chart which shows the emissions by source. So basically that's what it does. We think we did what we set out to do, but I'm now going to hand over to Andrew to talk about whether or not we actually solved the problem and what we learned along the way.
Good morning. Okay. Which button is it? That one. Oh, thank you. Technology. So we as part of the project, we thought very deeply about why these kind of projects fail. We've seen lots of technology platforms introduced across industries that, the great ideas, but just haven't gained traction. And we were very conscious going into this project that we wanted to have something that was going to both work for our stakeholders, but also that was going to potentially have longevity into commercialisation pathways, etc. In order to do this, we set up a very strong vocal set of our project steering group that represents organisations from right the way across the wine supply chain. And that's everything from the sand that goes into the wine bottles all the way through to the shipment and the transportation of the product into international markets. We're also very lucky to been able to leverage a fair amount of international experience. So our technology partner, ASA, they were able to help us get access to international projects such as the Catena X initiative, which is a European automotive initiative to track carbon emissions through supply chain that uses technology such as things like the international data spaces and others. And most of the large European automotive manufacturers are using this platform, and they're using the e-liability method as well. So we were able to leverage a lot of existing learning that, again, just reduced risk to the project around, are we doing the right thing, and is this something that has got legs? We also had the backing of the e-liability Institute as well. So these are the people that had come up with the activity-based accounting approach to product carbon footprints. And what's really great about this is that you can attach product carbon footprint essentially to your invoiceable items as your products pass up and down the supply chain. So from that point of view, it's something that was really easy for our stakeholders to grasp. And they were a great help in terms of being able to really well articulate that to our stakeholders. And then finally, we've also had the support of System Bolaget over in, or Bolaget, sorry. I always pronounce it wrong, over in Sweden. And Anna talked about the government-run retailers, and that's one of those. Those guys over there, they're thinking very deeply about how they navigate this space, and we've been collaborating very closely with them to make sure that what we're bringing to them is both what they want and also fits into the infrastructure that they're putting in place. We've also worked very closely with the wine industry over here in Australia as well. So we've made sure that we're not double accounting, we're not adding additional burden to the growers and the other organisations in the supply chain. So things like the Sustainable Wine Growing Australia initiative, we've made sure that we're leveraging data that's coming from that. We're not doubling up as well. So again, we've been very careful not to put additional load on our stakeholders. In terms of the broader sort of agtech initiatives, we also know that there's a lot of activity happening in this space. And again, we've made sure that this platform is a sum of a loose set of parts. So what we've tried not to do is reinvent the wheel in any way. So as Anna said earlier, we've made sure that the product carbon footprint calculator can be swapped out for others. This has been very important to our stakeholders as well. A lot of them have already calculated all of their PCFs, so they wanted to be able to bring that to the platform and not be forced into using a calculator that we brought to them. We've also made sure that we're aligning with standards around things like AgTrace and the traceability protocols, making sure that if in the future the project wants to leverage things like the Australian Agriculture Data Exchange platform, we can do that for interoperability of data. And then finally, we've made sure that we've taken into account all of the principles of the National Farm Federation's farm data code as well, to make sure that we're good citizens from a governance perspective. So all of that's been baked into the project approach that we've worked with Asanway with as well. And of course, we've got the Asanway experience developing this into multiple enterprises around the world. We've also designed it for operationalisation. So from day one, we've considered who's going to pay for this going forward. How do we make sure that this can wash its face once the project finishes? And how do we make sure that this has a longevity into the industry? And then finally, we've also made sure that we're really cognizant of this initiative's place in the AASF as well. So how do we make sure that this works with everything else that everybody else is doing? So the big question is, does it solve the problem? Well, we think it does. We think it does, but we're in the process of testing that at the moment. So the project, as it stands, is now going into the user acceptance testing phase of the program, and we're now testing that with all of our stakeholders. We're really one of the things that we're really pleased with is that this leads by the industry. So before the partners start to demand for how we should be recording and displaying this information, we're providing industry leadership into this. It also gets us ahead of the curve as well. So we're not going to be rushing at the last minute to get all of this set up. In terms of things that we've still got to do, we need to make sure that we build trust in supply chain. I think you were mentioning as well around, this is just the beginning and we need to build trust now. We need to make sure that we get our accuracy in place. So again, as I say, if we're bringing all of these different carbon calculators into the mix, how do we make sure that we get consistency and accuracy? And then finally, as I say, we've considered cost, but we've now got to find somebody to help us either pay for this or get industry behind us to move it forward. And that last little bit was a bit rushed because everything's gone red, but other than that, that's our project.
And thanks for noticing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Apart from getting my head stuck on Facebook for wine, which sounded fabulous, I'd really like to hear the community first, technology last component. I think fabulous that you looked at it from that lens, because often when I hear about a lot of the projects that are going on, and look, to be fair, it's not just agriculture, but we tend to leap towards technology first. And then suddenly, once we've actually gone down that pathway, we then have to consider other aspects that you need to wrap around technology to enable it to be successful and deliver what it actually has to deliver. So great to hear that that was the sort of starting point for you too. So we're moving on now to how sustainability adds value to banking relationships. And I'm going to invite Carmel Onions from Commonwealth Bank up to the stage. Carmel leads agribusiness sustainability at CommBank, supporting climate resilience and natural capital. Carmel and her team launched Australia's first sustainability-linked loan for agriculture and the CommBank Agri Green Loan. Carmel works closely with producers to unlock opportunities in sustainable finance. So please welcome Carmel to the stage.
Thanks, Angela, and I definitely missed the memo that I could bring a friend along today to have two of us up here. Commonwealth Bank has been involved in the Australian Agricultural Sustainability Framework since way back when Australian Farm Institute, with Richard at the time, were running workshops to design it and develop it. And since then we've been involved through the community of practice, and we're about to undertake a test and learn to help come up with some of the use cases in a banking value chain to really try and embed the framework. But it's a really important contribution to the industry, and today I'm going to turn the session topic on its head a little bit. Rather than drivers of sustainability, I'm going to talk about sustainability as a driver of value. And I'm just going to run through just some kind of core concepts around how banks think about agricultural businesses and their sustainability strategies and ways that that sort of plays through for creating value for those businesses in their banking relationship. And then I actually wanted to share briefly some findings from some research that we sponsored with Farming of the Future, specifically looking at contributing to the knowledge base and the evidence base that these sustainability strategies that build natural capital really do add value. So this is a fairly standard accounting kind of reflection of how production flows through to financials. So sort of starting at the top left, productivity drives revenue, also drives input costs, which feed into profit, and profit accumulates over years to build equity. But of course, profit is not something we just look at in isolation for a particular year, because agriculture is very cyclical. So what we do is we look at the profitability through the cycle. So we're looking at the carrying capacity and how that might be changing over time. We're looking at the variability in income, and then those things all play into asset value, which can help with your equity position as well. And so while productivity is very key, banks look at profitability, and that's very much the key metric for the long-term financial resilience of a business. And so strategies that look to take cost out of the business or improve the long-term carrying capacity of that business are all things that are really kind of important contributors to reducing your cost of finance. And so the really important piece here is the strategy and the plan that's wrapped around the financials, the context. So while the AASF is trying to tell a story in global trading markets, it's really important for a business to tell its story, particularly if it's a story of transition, adopting sustainable practices or nature-based approaches to the farm that are going to sort of reveal things about the numbers that might not otherwise be obvious. And I'll use a couple of examples. So in a livestock situation, earlier destocking when it stops raining compared to what the industry average might be, might on the face of it look detrimental to the financial impacts, but actually through protecting the soil and ground cover, that might mean that when it does rain, you can get back into production quicker. And so that's an example of trying to reduce that income variability and that boom and bust. And similarly, another example in a livestock situation where maintaining a more sustainable stocking rate than perhaps the current industry average might help build that carrying capacity over time. So this slide here just really recognises the way the bank sees it, that there's this great overlap between financial outcomes and sustainable strategies that build natural capital, and lower net emissions. And from the last presentation, we saw that, for example, taking glass out of the bottle in a wine scenario reduces emissions and also creates value. So there's numerous examples where we see this win-win and sustainable strategies really aligning with financial resilience. And I'd really like to now just sort of share some research based on number 4 there, trees in landscapes. So we partnered and sponsored Farming for the Future to look at the economics of more trees in a landscape. And so just really quickly, Farming for the Future is about recognising that we don't just value on the balance sheet these kind of assets that we purchase, like livestock and fencing and wire and water and irrigation. We actually farm in a natural system, and so the quality of the water and the amount of vegetation and the habitat and the quality of the soil are also things that need to be kind of tracked and measured and managed and maintained and valued. But specifically, as we think about vegetation, there's this idea of hidden benefit, which I'd just really like to draw out. These are microbats, and they eat about 40% of their body weight of insects each night. And this research done by the University of South Australia really quantified the yield improvement when the crops were in proximity to habitats that housed these microbats, just because of the pest management benefit that's provided. And that really underpins this research. And so here is some data from CSIRO work that was leveraged as part of our sponsorship in this Farming for the Future work. And normally when we see trees, we often see the unproductive country sitting immediately underneath it. But what we don't see is the productivity benefit, and in this scenario measured out to 20 tree heights for having production in proximity to that vegetation area. So we do have some country sacrifice, but if those trees are planted in areas that are not being used or are unproductive anyway, we can get a win-win there. And so using this concept of hidden benefit and this 20 tree height benefit for production, the farmers that participated in this study that we sponsored received a whole bunch of information about their farms, and this concept of a proximity metric, it's an index from 0 to 1, and it really looks at in aggregate across your landscape the proximity of your production areas to trees, thinking about that 20 tree heights, and you come up with a score. And so that was hugely useful management information about the farm's natural capital. And then leveraging some of the incredible work that the Farming for the Future study has done. In that broader study, they've been able to identify statistically significant positive correlations between measures of natural capital and economic outcomes. And in our study, we leveraged this metric around proximity, which shows this positive correlation between gross margin per hectare and the amount of vegetation in proximity to production areas. And so for this farm on the right of the slide, they had a lower proximity score of 0.23. They've got some beautiful clumps of vegetation, but they also have some production areas that are relatively unsupported. And so their score of 0.23 is shown by the red dot, and potentially with some investment in more vegetation, there's potential upside. Farmers also in the study received this incredibly rich information about their properties. So this is looking at mean wind direction and speed over a 10-year period. And it was analysed by season, so spring, summer, winter, autumn, and looking at not only winds in totality, but also analysing the very, very hot winds in summer, the very, very cold winds in winter, and also scenarios where it's rained and then you get the cold wind, so you get that added chill. And for this farm, while the wind frequently comes from the east, the strongest winds that pack the biggest punch come from the west-northwest region. And so going back to this concept that vegetation can provide this sort of 20 tree height production benefit, leveraging the windrows information that these farmers got, it starts to allow analysis of how your your natural capital is working for your production system. And so this sort of picture up on the top left is sort of showing where the nature belts, the shelter belts, are really sort of providing that production benefit, which can then inform management decisions. It's a really key point I'd really love to make. While CommBank's not requiring emissions reporting in the most part for our customers, or data on the stock of your natural capital, it's really valuable management information, and we really see the opportunity of this new, rich, valuable information, and we wholeheartedly support producers who are investing in that information for their property. And so again, from this research, farmers were provided with reports showing what portion of their production area was shaded or sheltered, and then what portion of their paddocks had high levels of shelter, which again really just informs management. And just to finish off, we really wanted to try and quantify these outcomes, and we spent a lot of time engaging with the valuer community because we're trying to bring valuers along to really showcase that natural capital actually enhances the value of properties and business enterprises. So in this example, assume a 4,000 DSE farm with no trees at all. We were able to ascertain the number of days above 30 degrees. So for this farm, it was 60 days in a year. And using a farmer estimate of a medium case, the percentage loss of animal performance due to heat stress. So that's the condition. And so from the animals having no access to shade. So if we assume 30% here, we know from the research that the loss of gross margin per day per DSE as an average benchmarked works out at those numbers there, which then when we calculate through on a per annum basis could work out at $10,000 just additional gross margin from having shade for these animals. And so that's one component of the benefit of having vegetation in landscape. There's also avoided condition loss due to chill and rain, improved mortality rates for younger livestock, improved pasture productivity, that unseen benefit, or for crops. And of course, then if you're investing in new shelter belts, there's potential for carbon credits with a carbon project if that's of interest. And so just lastly, Angela mentioned at the start, we are trying to kind of really reward farmers who are undertaking these investments into their natural capital and developing things like the agri-green loan with incentivised interest rates for those investments to try and kind of recognise those strategies. 1 minute to spare. Thank you.
Thanks, Carmel. I think listening to what Carmel had to say, I actually have to admit I had my producer hat on, and there was nothing in anything that Carmel presented on that sounded like a particularly onerous practice or something different. It sounded to me a lot like normal farming practices, and it reminded me that at the beginning of the AASF project we actually did a survey of farmers to find out what they understood about sustainability and what they were doing on their farms in relation to sustainable practices. And when you ask the question, are you undertaking sustainable practices, a lot of them weren't sure, or they'd say no. But then when you actually dove deeper into, well, do you do this, and do you do this, and do you do this, it was yes, 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 yes. And that is because I think there is some mystery behind what sustainable practices actually are, and producers don't really understand that they are actually, in many, many cases, producing a product sustainably and using those practices sustainably as well. Thank you, Carmel. That was absolutely fascinating. So our final presentation before we move on to the panel session is Dr. Karen Moffat and Courtney Bailey from Verconic, and they are going to be talking about From Farm to Framework, embedding community trust. Karen is a social scientist and co-founder of Verconic, and he works globally to build community trust between industry, government and communities, helping sectors align sustainability efforts with public expectations. Courtney leads agricultural research at Verconic and is a 2025 participant in the NFF Diversity in Agriculture Leadership Program. She helps clients implement and embed trust-based strategies. So please welcome Kieran and Courtney to the stage. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and it's good to immediately disappoint an audience. So just me speaking, but Courtney is here in the room and encourage you to have a chat over the next day. So in I think a beautiful piece of programming, I'm going to try and draw together a few of the threads that we've been hearing about this morning. It's awesome to be here and to see some familiar faces. So talking about embedding community trust in agriculture's sustainability story, but just want to start by really kind of thinking about what sustainability frameworks are and how they operate and their potential, that they're more than just accounting for our actions and our behaviours and the things that we're working on, but a way to generate business value and a way to think about how to align performance of an industry with the expectations of key stakeholders. And in this case, we're going to be talking about broader community, which are also broader consumers. So interesting overlap there as well. Previous speakers have really done a great job of talking about the reason that we're moving towards more organised sustainability frameworks. So I won't spend too long on that, except to say that all of these things have had a bunch of different names over different times. And when I look at all those sustainability frameworks, you can see that they're an organisation of the way others view our industry and the things that others and ourselves hold to be important, the things that we want to focus on to ensure that industry is able to operate effectively into the future. It reminds me a lot of work that we've been doing for a long time around what drives social acceptability of an industry or a company or an institution. And as you can see there in that bottom diagram, which is from a paper we published in 2014, so a while ago now, that we organised those drivers of trust and acceptance are around three broad categories: the impacts and benefits that an industry brings, the relationship that it has with community, and the fairness that exists in that relationship. So both in terms of procedural fairness in the way that the relationship operates, and also distributional. Do we get a fair share of the benefits that flow from an industry? If we overlay on top of that the sustainability framework for agriculture, you can see that we're covering really beautifully the impact and benefit space. And it's not its job to really pick up the relational mechanics, but they are fundamental to building broader social acceptability. Also in this work, we know that trust sits really centrally in the process of translating community expectations and experiences of an industry's performance in each of these different categories into their level of acceptance or social license for an industry. So trust in this context is not just a nice to have, it's a pragmatic resource for supporting social license, for supporting community acceptability of that industry, which at its core for me, when I think about sustainability frameworks, is what a lot of those frameworks are seeking to capture. So in this presentation, I'm going to show you some data that speaks to the key drivers within this framework for social acceptability of rural industries in Australia. And they're going to pick up on some of the challenges in that data for rural industries to be thinking about as you consider its sustainability framework, sustainability more generally, and also pick up on a really pragmatic experience of a sustainability-linked loan, actually, that leverage sustainability performance for business benefit in a different industry. And I think there's some interesting parallels to think about there as well. Okay, so let's have a look at some data from rural industry. So this is from the Community Trust in Rural Industries program of research. Been collecting this data over 7 time points, about 7 or 8 years now. And in the most recent iteration, that was 4,300 participants from Australia, and a representative sample of the population. And almost 30,000 Australians have participated in this research across that time period. So this is a really significant data set to be leaning into and looking at trends across time with. So you can see that we also measure or asked participants about a range of other things. So typical stuff, age and gender and that sort of good gear. But also we're asking about things like the extent to which you have relationships within rural industries. And we find in this data that if you have at least one relationship with somebody who works in rural industries, your attitudes towards rural industries are much more positive than people who don't know anybody. And that effect is much more more significant than where you live. So when we hear about city-country divide, this effect is much stronger than the city-country divide in the data that we see. But that's an aside and an interesting one we might pick up on a little bit later. So in this data, we're trying to understand all of those things, community perceptions around all of those things that are in the Ag Sustainability Framework, as well as those other features that we know inform acceptability of an industry, so fairness and confidence in governance and those sorts of things as well. And then what we do is to take that data, we model it. We try and understand what are the key drivers of all of those issues, what are the most important and material to social acceptability or social risk, to put that another way. So when we did that analysis on the 2025 data, we found a really interesting change from the previous year, and something that I think is particularly relevant in this context today, which is the top two drivers of trust in rural industries and acceptance of its activities are both very centrally sustainability related. So first of all, on-farm sustainability practices. The more confident that community members were that farmers and others working directly in ag industries are using chemicals responsibly, that are using additives in say animal diets responsibly, and also using water responsibly, the more they trusted rural industries and accepted its activities. And then the second strongest driver was the broader industry commitment to sustainability around impact management and resource stewardship. So those two things together are accounting for a really large proportion of variability in trust and acceptance, so social licence of rural industries. And that's different from last year. So last year it was really about industry sustainability, and now we can see the rise of on-farm sustainability practices also really driving social licence to operate. And then finally, industry responsiveness was a strong driver of trust and acceptance as well. And this is about the extent to which rural industries are listening to community concerns about perhaps some of those issues, responding effectively to those concerns, following through on commitments and involving community members in decisions that affect them. So if we were just to take the sustainability framework, we'd leave out and not think about that responsiveness element. So what we're going to do with our understanding of community views and expectations around industry behaviour in those categories. And then just briefly, I want to pick up on the central role of trust here, that it is the benefit of the doubt when things go wrong. That's why it's such a really important resource. It's less cynical ears when an industry is seeking to make the case for why something went wrong and what you're going to be doing to mitigate that risk in the future. It's also the permission to innovate, to try new things, and that's really vital in the sustainability space, to find novel solutions to old problems and have the permission to try and fail in the pursuit of that outcome. So let's look at then the performance of rural industries on some of these key measures. So here we've got trust and acceptance over time. Each pair of columns represents a time point in this program of research from year 1 through to year 6, and we've got an extra data point in one of those years around COVID as well. But really what you can see here is that two things. The scores here are really quite strong and solid. So we've got pretty high levels of trust within the Australian community and really quite strong levels of acceptance within the Australian community. The second key point is that they haven't changed much at all across this period of time. And we do this work across lots of different industries in 20-odd countries around the world, and things don't change when we don't change our behaviour. These are issues, these are outcome measures that can move if we are focusing on those things that drive these outcomes. So the things that I spoke about in the last slide. So let's pick up on one of those, and just to illustrate that point a little bit further. The use of weed control chemicals in Australian rural industries really worries me. That's one of the items as part of one of those sustainability drivers of trust and acceptance. And I've split this data by those that live in metropolitan areas and those that live in non-metropolitan areas. And you can see there is a subtle difference there, but it's not statistically significant. The pattern in this data is exactly the same, and it is actually really stable across time. So we haven't moved community sentiment around the use of chemicals in rural industries. That hasn't changed over time. It's a key driver of trust and acceptance, and both of those key outcome measures haven't changed much over time as well. So this is a real challenge to say we understand the mechanism of social licence in rural industries in the Australian population. We understand that lots of the things that we're measuring out of sustainability framework are part of that story, and we haven't been able to move those things substantially across time. We're leaving money on the table is a way to think about this. And I want to show you an example of a company that picked up this kind of methodology and used it to drive organisational culture change and then organisational value off the back of that. So we work with a company called Lundin Mining. They're a Vancouver-based mining company. At the start of this work, they were operating at 7 mine sites, divested a few, are now at 4. They're in multiple countries, and we operate our version of this research at a local level with communities in each of those locations. Now, they were really interested to make sustainability central to their business as a differentiator, as a mid-tier miner, and as a way of driving behaviours in that company that they knew were going to lead to better behaviours, and also to be a useful tool for attraction and retention of high-quality personnel in a really competitive landscape, something that's quite similar to rural industries here in Australia. And we would collect that data every 6 months for these assets. And in 2024, Lundin Mining were able to secure a $2.4 billion US sustainability-linked loan that had 2 components. And as we've heard, sustainability-linked loans are a really fantastic mechanism for getting finance at a cheaper rate if you can demonstrate sustainability credentials on agreed metrics. The 2 sets of metrics that they were able to agree with 4 banks for this loan, half of those metrics were around greenhouse gas abatement, and half of those metrics were our measures around community sentiment with regards to the way community felt treated in that relationship. So the extent to which they perceived the company was listening to them effectively, following through in its commitments, involving them in decisions that affect them, and were willing to change the behaviour based on community concerns. So a perception-based metric was half of the measure that was being used to evaluate and assess their performance on a $2.5 billion sustainability-linked loan. Only the second SLL that had an externally facing social metric involved in it. Well, what this did, though, for the organisation was transformative. It elevated social performance, or the management of social risk, from the GM of social performance to the CFO and the CEO. And they then drove expectations around performance through KPIs through the whole business, from top to bottom. It elevated that conversation. And what it meant then is that on the ground, those assets, that it wasn't just the social sustainability people who were in charge of that. They then drove KPIs out laterally through the organisation to those people who owned those impacts that were being created and measured through our data. So to those people that were the head of environment, the head of blasting, the head of maintenance in those assets. And what did that lead to? Well, on the ground, here are our acceptance scores over time. You can see that actually at this asset in Chile, their scores were tanking over 3 time points, 18 months. Introduced this sustainability-linked loan, this culture change really washed through the organisation. And really quickly and dynamically, their ratings on this key outcome measure went through the roof in what is the greatest comeback story in our data set over the last 15 years. So sustainability isn't just about measuring what you're doing, but about driving who you want to be and how you want to position that as a way to differentiate and drive performance within both industries and individual companies. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Kieran. I think I'm just going to reiterate something you said that I think is worth reiterating for the group, and that is that things don't change when we don't change our behaviour. Thank you very much, and my apologies, you did tell me that it will only be you presenting, so if that's the worst I do today, I reckon I'm doing all right. All right, so I'd like to just invite the leads of each of the projects to come up on stage, and we're going to shift to a bit of a conversation where we have an opportunity to ask some questions and have a discussion amongst the speakers that you've heard today. We do have a chair for this session, and I would like to welcome Hugh Killen onto the stage. Hugh is the Managing Director of Impact Ag, where he is at the forefront of merging finance and farming, creating a blueprint for a world where agriculture is both profit positive and nature positive. He has extensive leadership experience in agriculture and investment. So please welcome our chair for the session, Hugh, and could I ask the others to join Hugh on stage, please? Thanks, Hugh. Yeah. Hopefully the microphones work. All right, I'll leave it with you.
Just going to say something. So the microphone does work, so we're all good. There's a couple of things that I've just, to start the conversation off, I think is really interesting. I think DJ's introduction today saying we are the industry, we the industry. I mean, I think we have some of the solutions ourselves, so it's great to hear that one put forward. And then Matt Lowe talking about looking ahead to the future. And today for me is all about the future. Like to have a conversation here, guys, so I'm not going to go question to question to question. I might start where we finished with you, Kieran. You're actually in this very sexy black T-shirt in my little photo here, by the way, not a suit, so you've taken me by surprise. You talked about London Mining, the company, and the company's responsiveness to community and GHG abatement, and I get that. It's a really powerful measure in something like mining. If we try and draw a parallel between mining and agriculture, what do you think are the biggest disconnects between what the communities expect, or our communities expect, and what we're currently positioning from an ag perspective?
Yeah, sure. And I've never looked sexy in a black T-shirt, so it's confusing for all of us. So agriculture and mining are different in lots of ways. Obviously, with mining, you have a really focused area of impact and then a broader circle of potential benefit as well. However, shared landscapes, shared workforces, share policy agendas in lots of ways, and are also at the centre of some of the world's kind of really critical challenges. And I think that even where there are big differences, that there are opportunities for ag and mining to work together to think about landscape level issues as it relates to sustainability. And what we see in our data with communities is that they don't differentiate, certainly within sectors, but often across either, about the extent to which you're responsible here and you're responsible there. Actually, that they're looking for collective ways to manage their interests, their vulnerabilities, and also to maximise benefits for broader community.
Carmel, I might throw to you now, and one of the points that Kieran had in his presentation was 45% of people have no personal relationship with rural industry. CommBank's obviously, one of the largest bankers to the community. I mean, do you guys spend time thinking about that when you approach agriculture and, making loan decisions and financing the industry?
Around bringing country and city together? No. In the sustainability strategy, we're very focused on farmers, but what we do have is a brilliant franchise that we can plug into. And one of the things we're looking at is our retail base is very connected into our app, and how can we bring together city and country customers through the app. So, for example, is it an offer to consumers to highlight some of our agricultural brands, or to plug in city people to investing in nature and carbon rehabilitation with some of our rural customers. So it's a really sort of new component of my work. We've been very focused on just understanding sustainability for farmers and what we can do to support in a silo, but now, longer term, that is definitely part of the plan.
Yeah, and if I go across and probably take the conversation a little bit across to Neil and Anna, and we think about traceability and sustainability and embedding that along the supply chains. And I think it might have been you, Anna, or your colleague in the presentation talking about our scope 1 is our buyer scope 3, ultimately at the end of the day. And coming back to the point around, a lot of society now not really understanding what we do as farmers. When you think about your products in market, do you think consumers are rewarding, in particular things like wine, around pricing, ability to pay?
I'll go first. We see a lot of data, like we saw today, about the different studies about the willingness to pay for sustainability. And I think we see one thing that we also saw today, that there's a difference from market to market, but probably the big thing is the say-do gap. Most people will say that they're prepared to pay more, but there's not so much evidence of people actually paying more. And I've said this before, and so don't laugh at me, but people already think wine is sustainable. And I'm not boasting, but they do. They think glass is sustainable. They think it comes from grapes, which are, from the land. So compared to other alcoholic beverages, it sort of already has that good reputation. And I think that also limits people's willingness to, or feeling of need to pay more for sustainable.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Dr. Hastie used an example of the UK, I think, and the way that I think consumers' preferences have moved there strongly, and I think Brexit was probably one of the things that really helped them with that as well. They had to actually look back into the industry and make some decisions about how they're going to support their own farmers. If I come to you, Neil, thinking about Victoria, thinking about making sure that sustainability credentials always attract a premium, and you talked about making sure we had the right credentials across not only state but also federal settings. I mean, how are you thinking about achieving that?
In collaboration, because it's a big problem. Well, it's a complex issue, not a problem. Sorry, that's a policy word, problem. It's a very complex issue, so we've got to work together to be able to achieve that. And yeah, it is complex out there, and as Anna said, if you take wine, for example, you probably might get a good price for it in the UK, whereas you're not going to get it for cherries, for example. There's complexities around market access. Say, into Malaysia, you need to have halal certifications, so they are valued credentials. Interestingly, in Malaysia, you don't want to call your product palm oil free to protect the orangutans because it's actually illegal in Malaysia. So you don't want to label that on your product. So you really got to know your market. You've got to really be able to understand that, and that's it. Each business needs to be able to do that. They need to use the resources that are available to them. So whether that's talking to Austrade, whether that's talking to their, in Victoria, we've got an organisation called Global Victoria, or whether it's talking to your industry association to get those insights. We've provided a lot of information around traceability, which is available on our website. We've got a quick start guide for traceability to help businesses understand how it could benefit their business and how they can link it to credentials. They can develop a business case out of that. They can take it to their bank and ask for money, or through their executive to do so. So we're trying to find ways to engage, but we can't do it by ourselves. It's a combined effort of everybody, and everybody's got to have the buy-in to do that. So,
and if I take the and probably a question for all of you on the panel, really, whoever wants to dive into it. If I think about, we've had a conversation today around the sustainability shift, and we've talked about the future of traceability within the industry as well. And there's a transition and a shift that needs to happen, whether it's valuing natural capital, whether it's understanding embedded emissions data within your supply chains. That requires, obviously, focus and concentration pre-farm gate. It also requires capital flowing post-farm gate back into ag industries. As I listen through today, how do you think, and who do you think who's going to end up paying in the transition? Might be interesting to start that off with you, Kieran, actually. So ultimately to get a, whether it's a sustainability linked loan to work, CBA is going to have to put up some margin to actually make that happen. But more broadly, as we think about industry, there needs to be a financial incentive, not just an environmental one somewhere along the lines as well. So who ends up actually earning that?
Yeah, great question. I think about it from the other side, which is what value we're creating in this business that differentiates us from other businesses we're competing against or markets that we're trying to enter in competition with others. And in establishing those credentials, in demonstrating transparency, in establishing trust, we're de-risking business. So we're taking away some of the costs that make it harder to compete against lower cost producing countries in an export context. And I think that's where it comes from in the end. But yeah, getting that capital flowing in the front end is critical. And that sustainability linked loan example, we've had a couple of those, I think are really nice ones where institutions are looking further than profit margin or further than the balance sheet to go, well, what's possible here? That sort of three-dimensional thinking is really important if we're going to actually make some progress in a sea of organisations that are just trying to optimise right now in a really kind of difficult work environment.
Sure, and I think about we're talking about premium drivers as well in wine, for example, and obviously CommBank's got the financing products in there to start the capital flowing through. But if I think about the premium, that's if I take a retail product like wine, there's a premium in market. Does that actually get back to the producer? And does that actually get all the way back upstream to actually enable that transition? I'll throw it open to you, but it's obviously a wider question as well.
I'd love to say yes, but I do think, with the exception of win-wins, it does come at a cost. And I think we're seeing it more as a permission to play rather than a value add in most circumstances. I think there's some clever marketing around sustainability that if you can get it to resonate with the consumer and you can get a bit of a following of a brand, then there's some exceptions to the rule. But ultimately, the economy has to pay for it. And it's either going to be the buyer or the seller. And as you've probably heard if you've read the news about how the wine industry is going at the moment, it's a buyer's market, not a seller's market. So ultimately, it's the seller, it's the producer that's paying in our industry.
Yeah. Carmel, you got a view there?
Yeah, I think the answer is sort of multifaceted. So, environmental markets exist to give land stewards remuneration for the cost of, sustainability strategies. And I'm working in something called the Climate Leaders Coalition, which is looking across the supply chain. The value of carbon insets and nature credits from farmers managing land to accumulate those has value, and that data, as it's passed through the supply chain, how should the supply chain be sharing the cost and actually valuing, the work that's being done on farm. So those value exchange mechanisms are being thought through, excuse me, in the absence of a carbon price that can really kind of be that mechanism. And then there's sustainable finance, and then there's grants, and then there's payback on farm just from the underlying investment in some of these sustainable practices that Angela was sort of referring to after my presentation. So I think it's a mix, and it's not going to be one silver bullet.
Yeah. Just a couple of minutes left. If there's any questions from out on the floor before I move on?
Come from behind you.
Georgie.
Thanks, Hugh, and thanks to you all. Probably for you, Kieran, I'm really interested in how we aggregate trust when we've such a diverse industry. So when you work with one company, I get that you can drive cultural change, you can have real impact, so that's great in our family business on farm. But how do we as an industry, and I guess from my perspective, how does NFF drive that sort of change and trust and lift it across 85,000 businesses? And that to me is a crux of a challenge. So, you can drive it at a corporate level for a few businesses. You might be able to drive it at a sector where you trust the terroir of a wine. But how do we drive that community trust when we're so fragmented and we are seen as small businesses across the country, and that's what people love?
Yeah, so you're right. The measurement needs to reflect the scale we're looking at. So yeah, we presented national sector level ratings there. We also measure trust in individual industries, and also through some other analyses understand what are the key drivers of trust in those industries as well, which is then really useful to be thinking about these numbers in the context of that industry. And then, I think that going drilling deeper into individual companies is absolutely what we do for other sectors and other industries. In terms of what you do at the kind of aggregated level, I think, that one of the challenges is there are fewer levers to pull at a sectoral level than there are at an individual level where you've got personal local relationships. But things like if 44% of people don't have a connection to somebody in rural industries, actually a big chunk of those people do, they just don't know they've got a connection. So how do we empower people who work in rural industries to make that part of their visible identity in the relationships that they have with others in their community? And to be able to talk about those things, because what those conversations do is to help them to understand how rural industries tackle sustainability issues. It gives them context to evaluate an industry within. And what we show in our data is that if they have that context, they have those relationships, it leads to a much stronger starting point for working on the more challenging areas. And I should also say, sort of making the point around the level of trust and acceptance being solid but not great and steady over time. The proportion of Australians who think rural industries do good things for the country and are an important part of our national story and our economy is in the 90%. Like basically nobody disagrees with that. The position of rural industries in Australia is amazing. It's just that on some of these sustainability issues, we want to have deeper conversations and see some progress. And that's a great place to be. So I think they're the sorts of conversations to have through those relationships.
I think we probably have time for another one or two questions, I think. So,
hello. Good morning, and thank you very much for the presentations. My name is John Lowe. I'm a farmer from central west New South Wales. My probably thoughts are the difference between practice and reporting. There's a lot of people who will probably adopt new and improved practice if they can see an economic return. The reporting part of it is probably seen by many as a threatening process, and where their data and reporting goes and how it's used, and whether it's used by people up the chain to drive their returns down, not up. And I'd appreciate some comments.
I don't want to put you on, Carmel, you might want to talk to that a little bit in terms of how you guys are thinking about reporting and emissions, and it's voluntary at CBA and it should hopefully be interesting.
Yeah, we're very respectful of the issues that you raised. They're very common and very important. So for us, we just have to take a very transparent approach to how we use information. When we invited our customers to a complimentary workshop to measure their emissions to help with some of the cost of onboarding some of this new measurement into their business, it was consensual that the customer's happy to share it with us. So we were very clear on what we were using the information for, but I'm not sure if that's enough of a protection. I mean, it's certainly the philosophy that we took, but I think it's a super valid question, and a lot of the technology that's being built to support emissions measurement, for example, has permissioning so that the farmer can control where that information goes, which is hugely important. It should be at least the minimum standard that the farmer has.
I think with that, we're pretty much out of time, so we might wind it up here now. I think the point is they know you're...
Sorry, Hugh. Sorry, I had one. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, Patrick.
No, it's all right.
I wouldn't want to cut you off.
No, it wouldn't be the first time. Sorry, Pat Hutchinson, Chair of the Australian Beef Sustainability Framework. Probably a question to the panel, but to everyone. 90% of what I've heard so far today, and everyone's used the term lovingly, sustainability, you've all talked about environmental stewardship. So how are we going to start having a more broader conversation? It even comes down to the research that's been done, which uses the term sustainability, yet from what I see, it's talking about environmental stewardship. When, say, for the beef sustainability framework, a very big framework within agriculture, where we also talk about economic resilience, we talk about animal care, and really importantly, we talk about people. So how do we then reflect that? Because, you can get economic resilience from getting a wonderful sustainable loan from the Commonwealth Bank, but how do I then also then reflect, and how does the supply chain going to do that? So I think, you know, I'm really keen to figure out how we unpack that a bit more from everybody, because I think we're narrowing ourselves down. We're only talking about one component, or we've bastardised the term sustainability, yet it's so broad. How are we going to also talk to people about those other key areas too?
Yeah, I'm happy to have a go. I think it's national leadership, and I think if you actually look at the Australian Agricultural Sustainability Framework, it covers off all of those items you just mentioned. So it is very broad, and I think it's really important, and I think that's why we're here today. That leadership is really quite critical, and when I talked about earlier about collaborating and working together, it's towards a goal, and I think that goal is that framework, and everybody can sort of see their actions in and amongst that, which I think is really important and critical too. So
I'll have a go. It's a super valid point, and it is, I think there's a language issue in this space that helps us really sort of articulate the nuances that you've mentioned. Certainly it's all interconnected, so nature-based solutions can have great animal welfare outcomes, which all feeds into sort of finance. So, you know, and same for people, like health and safety incidents are bad for business as well as being bad for, you know, our people. So I think it's probably a little unsaid, but you're right to call it out. But I think it also, to what Neil said, these sustainability frameworks are so important, whether it's Australian beef one or it's one like the AASF that kind of crosses, you know, supply chains and value chains. We base, you know, in Commonwealth Bank, our sustainability linked loans on the priorities already identified in those frameworks. So industry sort of leading that work that others can then sort of leverage is just so important.
All right, I'm going to pull us up there. Thank you so much to our speakers for this morning's session, and also our chair, Hugh. Really appreciate it. And Pat, thanks for that last minute's conversation. I think keep it in mind, as Carmel just said, it's good of you to call it out. Keep it in mind as we go through the course of the day, though, because you know, we do need to make sure that we're looking at sustainability holistically. I will just mention a couple of things for you to think about as you connect with your peers in the room over morning tea. A couple of the big topics that have come out through this morning's session: trust and value, and what does that mean to you as you in your projects, and what do you think that means from a sustainability perspective? Morning tea will be through those doors now. We're going to call you back here in about 25 minutes, so we'll start calling last drinks, and if we can return promptly, that would be fantastic. Thank you again to our speakers.